May the 8th, 1945, the war in Europe was over. Thus, wrote Winston Churchill later, did the great democracies triumph, and so were able to resume the follies which had so nearly cost them their lives. An historian has written,
"When the guns fell silent, a different Germany remained behind. Something had been done that nothing in the world could ever again undo. Neither repentance nor shame, neither feelings of guilt nor efforts at compensation."
Not all the Jews of Hitler's Europe had been exterminated. Some 1.5 million survived, broken, starved, intimidated, unable even to comprehend their deliverance. And beyond the simple fact of their liberty, what had they? A Jew wrote,
"Their life was a series of negatives. Hatred of the soil on which they stood, hatred of the Christian world that had deserted and doomed them, hatred of law, and an apathy and inability to plan, rebel, or be mended. Yet they were not altogether lost, because one Jewish aspiration lived miraculously with them through the Holocaust: Zionism."
Zionism, the return of the Jewish people to their promised land, to Palestine. Palestine. The tides of conflict had hardly touched here, and the country prospered. By now, the Arabs numbered upward of 1 million people, the Jews less than 500,000. But in the overt struggle for Palestine, it was no longer to be a simple question of numbers. While the Arabs clung tenaciously to a traditional pattern of life, the Jews drove inexorably towards their distant goal, a Jewish state. Their progress was hampered by the terms of the pre-war British White Paper, a source of aggravation and frustration to Zionists and Jews alike. The White Paper permitted only 1,500 Jewish immigrants to enter Palestine each month. Now, the 5-year period covered by the White Paper was about to expire. A new policy would soon have to be found. Even before the war ended, politicians had turned to the problems again of what a writer had called John Bull's Other Ireland. In December 1944, Clement Attlee, Deputy Prime Minister in the War Cabinet, told a Labour Party conference,
"There is surely neither hope nor meaning in a Jewish national home unless we are prepared to let Jews, if they wish, enter this tiny land in such numbers as to become a majority. There was a strong case for this before the war. There is an inevitable case now."
The new American president, Truman, also turned his attention to the stricken Jews. At the Potsdam Conference, 2 months after the war ended, Truman, himself an emotionally convinced Zionist, wrote to Churchill,
"The drastic restrictions imposed upon Jewish immigration continue to provoke passionate protest from many Americans. They fervently urge the lifting of these restrictions, which deny to Jews who have been so cruelly uprooted by Nazi persecutions entrance into the land which represents, for so many of them, their only hope of survival."
But Churchill was defeated in the July election, and Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. Ernest Bevin, his Foreign Secretary. The new government cautiously felt its way among the shoals of foreign policy. It believed that Palestine and the Jews had a low priority among the terrible problems that faced them in the grim aftermath of war. But as the true horror of the concentration camps was made known, rational judgment and the measured tempo of administration became impossible. Everywhere, people were demanding that something should be done for the Jews. The Zionist movement's leaders paraded the misery and degradation of their people in a calculated effort to discover whether the white paper policy was alive or dead. They demanded that 100,000 immigrants from the German camps be allowed into Palestine immediately, as of right. Bevin refused. The white paper formula must stand for the time being. But an American observer had been sent by Truman to visit the camps. He reported,
"If there is any genuine sympathy for what these survivors have endured, some reasonable modification of the white paper ought to be possible without too serious repercussions. For some European Jews, there is no acceptable or even decent solution for their future other than Palestine."
Truman agreed and declared his policy at a press conference.
The American view is that we want to let as many of the Jews into Palestine as it is possible to let into that country.
Angrily, Attlee warned him that without Arab agreement, such a policy would set aflame the whole Middle East. While governments exchanged notes and the homeless Jews of Europe languished in the rubble of shattered cities and refugee camps, the Zionists moved amongst them and offered them a future. They told the drifting Jews that now they were wanted and needed simply because they were Jews. They turned for help to the Haganah, officially tolerated as the Jewish Army of Palestine, unofficially a body of men and women waging a ceaseless battle for the Zionist cause. In Europe, they forged visas, they bribed officials, they lied and stole and took fearsome risks. Whilst a few immigrants reached Palestine as part of the legal quota, the Haganah succeeded in opening a secret route for thousands from the dark heart of Europe to the distant sunshine of their promised land. Battened down in cattle trucks, in ramshackle lorries, women and children, orphans, and the very... The ships themselves were rotten and unsafe, bought by the Haganah from among the incredible marine flotsam that lay rotting all over Europe. There were disused cattle boats, retired paddle steamers, ferries brought from rivers nobody wished to cross anymore. And all were loaded to the very limits of safety with refugees. Politicians in London denounced the escape operations as a slave trade. But David Ben-Gurion, chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency, said,
"I was in London when the remnants of the British Army were desperately trying to get back from Dunkirk. They didn't wait for the luxury of the Queen Mary, nor did they care about the seaworthiness of the ramshackle, filthy little boats which assembled to save them. We suffered a greater disaster in Europe than the British Army. Not a few thousand, not tens of thousands, but millions. 6 million were put to death. Can anyone realize 1 million Jewish babies burned in the gas chambers?"
A refugee wrote,
Moving about on deck was an extremely hazardous undertaking. It was packed solid with people. Those few who succeeded in finding room to lie full length were always in danger of being trampled. The popularity of the deck was due to the indescribable overcrowding and the nauseating atmosphere below.
This illegal traffic in Jews intent on returning to Palestine had been started before the war. It was an operation marked with disasters. In 1939 alone, at least 3 ships had sunk with a loss of over 1,000 lives. It was still a risk, but for people with so little to lose, it was as nothing. And there was always hope that the perilous journey would carry them beyond the prying eyes of the aircraft, past the blockading ships of the British. Only 1 in 12 of the refugee boats got through. In all, the Royal Navy intercepted 57 of them. The immigrants emerged, frightened and blinking into the sunlight. Sickened with disappointment, sickened with fear, they awaited the boarding parties. Once more, armed men were to herd and humiliate them, and a gun was to stand between them and where they sought to go. It was a grim story. The tense, embarrassed British soldiers or sailors carried out unpalatable orders and cursed that it should be them. The briefest glimpse of the grey dockside, all they were to see of the sacred soil of their promised land, and crying and struggling, the refugees would be guided through barbed wire passages to be led on board another crowded ship, destined once more for internment, this time in Cyprus. But others, a few, got through. They came ashore at night on the long, sandy coastline of Palestine, their few possessions bundled on their backs. Some of them fell to their knees as they landed, scooped up handfuls of the runny sand and kissed the soil of the promised land. Once they were landed, the immigrants were rushed off through the night to reception centers. Frightened, unskilled, beaten, and often hopelessly unable to communicate or live sociably, the spiritually humiliated survivors of Hitler's Holocaust had to be found new homes, work, and normality. Unclaimed children, their parents dead or lost, came, mostly with official British approval, to rebuild their childhood in Palestine. In special homes, they were tended and steered gently towards taking their places in the nation their elders were trying to carve out. It was a long and often difficult task. The children stole and lied, awoke in the night screaming, relived in moments of agony terrors they could never forget. Adult immigrants admitted by the British government numbered 17,000 in 1946, 21,000 in 1947, 17,000 in 1948, fewer than had arrived before the outbreak of war. But those who came illegally under the protective wing of the Haganah numbered 50,000, doubling the British quota. Some of the newcomers found their way onto the kibbutzim, which were pushing their settlements further and further into land that had often lain barren for centuries. Conditions were rough, but after the life they had left in Europe, the stark purity of the kibbutz came to some as a balm. A pioneer wrote,
"Our little home, the kibbutz, is flourishing. Our cattle shed is growing. We have bought some more cows. We'll soon have 1,000 chickens. We have built 2 bungalows and bought another car, and we've begun making stockings. We've had our first baby. His mother is 19. We now number over 80.
New settlements were hacked out of the parched wastes by the Dead Sea, and land that had lain as though dead beneath crusted salt was won back, acre by acre. And all the while, pressure upon the Attlee government to resolve the problem of Palestine mounted. Attlee wrote to Truman.
The terms of the mandate require that we facilitate Jewish immigration while ensuring the rights and position of other sections of the population. This dual obligation with the Jews on the one side and the Arabs on the other has been the main cause of the trouble during the past 26 years. Both countries lay claim to Palestine, the one on the ground of a millennium of occupation, the other on the ground of historic association. The antithesis is thus complete.
The Foreign Secretary, Bevin, told a press conference, if the Jews want to get too much at the head of the queue, you will have the danger of anti-Semitic reaction. Zionist propagandists rephrased the remark. They want to jump the queue. Jews in Palestine showed their anger at his procrastination. The terrorist bands of the Irgun and the Stern unleashed wave after wave of attack on British soldiers and British installations. If words did not move Bevin, they reasoned, such actions would. The spilling of blood became a commonplace in the dusty streets of Palestine. British troops were gunned down, officials kidnapped and assassinated. The authorities met terrorism with repression. The British soldier had once stood as the protector of the Jew against Arab attacks. He had been accused of being the tool of Zionism. He had liberated the Jews of Europe. Now he was trying to act as the guardian of the rights of all the peoples in Palestine. But to the Jew, he was now the oppressor, the anti-Semite, the enemy.
The old Arab will take a pot shot at you in the night and offer you a cup of coffee when you come to investigate in the morning. But the Jew you're trying to protect just glowers and doesn't even offer you coffee. It's a thankless task.
3 illegal militias, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Sternists, were engaged in acts of sabotage and violence. Their agents, furtive and brave, sowed the seeds of their propaganda among the people.
We are fighting against a regime based on bad faith, on repudiation of solemn pledges and international obligations. A regime of threats and oppression. This little country belongs to us. It is our old historic motherland, dreamt of by tens of generations, sacred by the blood of heroes and fighters. It was promised to us. It is the only haven for millions of Jews.
The outbreak of violence coincided with the arrival in Palestine of the Joint Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which Attlee had suggested to President Truman. Ernest Bevin, harassed and obstinate, had agreed he would accept their recommendations if they were unanimous. Their report, published in April 1946, was unanimous.
We emphatically declare that Palestine is a holy land, sacred to Christian and Jew and to Muslim alike. And because it is a holy land, Palestine is not and never can become a land which any race or religion can justly claim as its very own.
Nevertheless, they recommended that 100,000 Jewish immigrants from German camps should be admitted as soon as possible. Once more, that figure, 100,000. So few from amongst the pitiful million Jews in Europe, but so many in the finely balanced tensions of Palestine. In spite of his promise, Bevin rejected their recommendations. Under no circumstances, he believed, could the quota be increased. The Arab majority would not countenance it. Indeed, the Arab people were already viewing the influx of the Jews with mounting fear, mounting hatred, watching them turn a land that had once been dry and brown, green and fertile with flowing waters. They vowed to exterminate the Jew and confound the British infidels who protected them. Violence spread like an infection throughout Palestine. On June the 16th, the Haganah blew up 9 bridges, including the Allenby Bridge over the Jordan. The British responded with a curfew and street searches. Leaders of the Jewish community and suspected terrorists were arrested. The blaze of publicity which attended these measures raised the temperature of distrust. They notably failed to prevent one of the most callous acts in the bloody history of terrorism. July the 22nd, 1946. The Irgun had blown up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, used by the British as a government and military headquarters. It is said that when the terrorists telephoned to warn the duty officer to evacuate the building, he replied, "We are here to give orders to the Jews, not to take them." 10 minutes later, the bomb exploded and 91 people were killed, 45 wounded. The outside world was revolted. Hardly had the dust of the King David Hotel settled than the terrorists struck again. And by August 1946 had added 376 people, among them 300 civilians, to the roll of victims who had lost their lives. And all the while, the human stream flowed into Palestine. The British authorities watched the mounting chaos, aware that they were trapped between their own obstinacy, the increasing enmity of the Arab population, and the hardening of the Jewish will. Amid the anguish of the terrified populace, Jewish terrorists proclaimed,
"We recognize no one-sided laws of war. If the British are determined that their way out of the country should be lined by an avenue of gallows and of weeping fathers, mothers, wives, and sweethearts, we shall see to it that in this there is no racial discrimination. The gallows will not be all of one color, the tears not all of one racial origin. If the British claim that this is unfair because Jewish blood and tears, having been more frequently shed, are cheaper, we shall prove to them that their age-long cheapness has come to an end. Their price will be paid in full."
President Truman wrote to a friend,
"The situation looks insoluble. Not only are the British muddling the situation as completely as it could possibly be muddled, but the Jews themselves are making it impossible to do anything for them."
January 1947. A conference on Palestine, which had been meeting on and off since September, reconvened in London. As at earlier meetings, neither the Jews nor Palestinian Arabs attended. Tired and bewildered, Bevin took his place. It was the year of India, the handing over of the brightest jewel in Britain's great empire. Palestine seemed less than significant. Britain offered to divide Palestine into 2 provinces, one Arab, one Jew, each to enjoy local self-government. The immigration rate would be stepped up to 4,000 refugees a month for 2 years. None seemed to notice, or even to care, that under this proposal, the magical 100,000 would have been achieved. Arab and Jewish leaders rejected the offer. The conference table had become the symbol of faded hopes in a land now ruled by the bayonet and the bomb. 100,000 British troops tried vainly to keep the factions apart, but no mere barbed wire nor patrol could serve to keep separate the inflamed communities. Under the hot sun of Palestine, tempers ran high as Arab turned on Jew, Jew on Arab, and all hands were turned against the British soldiers as they strove vainly to keep the peace. The Foreign Secretary, Bevin, had described their dilemma and his in the House of Commons.
We have been faced with an irreconcilable conflict of principles. For the Jews, the essential point of principle is the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. For the Arabs, the essential point of principle is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of Palestine. His Majesty's government have no power under the terms of the mandate to award the country either to the Arabs or to the Jews, or even to partition it between them. The only course now open to us is to submit the problem to the judgment of the United Nations.
Bevin, by nature a simple, blunt man, had had enough. Now had the struggle for Palestine come to a crossroads. The two communities, Jew and Arab, drew inexorably apart as the words and deeds of their extremists began to tell. And between the bewildered, ordinary people, yearning only for peace, stood the British soldier. Their fate was to be settled in the new forum of the United Nations, due to reassemble at Lake Success in September. There, those who had been prodigal with advice but scant of aid would be asked to share in the task of solving an irreducible dilemma. Bevin had said,
"If the problem can be settled after 2,000 years of conflict, 12 months more will not be too long a delay."
But he was wrong.